Good morning. My name is Amy Bidwell. I'm the Senior Hazard Mitigation Planner for the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. My role with the council involves hazard mitigation planning as well as conducting and providing technical assistance for vulnerability assessments. Today, I'm joined by panelists with a range of expertise managing and conducting vulnerability assessments, and I would like to take a few moments and invite each of them to introduce themselves.
All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Eddie Boza. I've heard Bowza and Booza and Bozo, Bowser. Elementary school is fun. I'm with the Resilient Florida program, and it's a program primarily designed to help local governments adapt to the changing conditions. We have several grant opportunities for planning and implementation of projects. Recently created in 2021, 2019 was the first bill. We really started getting going in 21. And we sort of adapted from a coastal program that was focused on the coasts, and the legislature recognizing that non-coastal areas flood too. And so the Resilient Florida program was spun up, and we've been about through 3 cycles of grants now, and we'll have another opportunity coming up in July. So brief introduction, I'll leave it there. Hopefully there will be a lot of questions and we can divulge more as we go.
All right. Good morning still, I believe. Yeah. I'm Sam Sarkar. I'm with Half Associates. I'm a water resources engineer. I've been doing this for about 15 years now. Worked in watershed-based assessment and water resources assessment throughout the US, from California to North Carolina, and from the Rio Grande Valley in deep South Texas, all the way up to Lake Champlain. So been in the climate impacts assessment and mitigation game for those 15 years. Very fortunate to work with the EPA on the Global Change Research Program, big study, 15 watershed studies, looking at impacts of climate change on hydrology, water quality throughout the nation. Things have changed quite a bit in the last 15 years, and very fortunate to have been working with, on the grant funding from the Resilient Florida program. Half did one of the first vulnerability assessments in the state of Florida for the 9-county Appalachia region. It has been a learning process, and during the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen a lot of data come out, a lot more vulnerability assessments being conducted. So we are learning as we do these more and more. Let's see. We have done probably 10 or so in the past, one of them being in this region, Pasco County. We are in the midst of it, doing a vulnerability assessment. Hi, shout out to them. And Port Richey, another. So it's the scale, right? Going from county scale to a city scale. So different kinds of data requirements, challenges, etc. So I'll leave it at that, and we can talk more, I guess, as we move forward. So.
All right, let's see this thing working here. Yeah, so I am a wetlands ecologist, and I got into doing VAs about 15 years ago. It's kind of accidentally when I was up at the University of Georgia. And yeah, so we've been learning as we go along here. So Jason Evans, actually from Stetson University. And yeah, I grew up in Florida, I grew up in Orlando, and it was in the 80s, and it was a time that we didn't have a lot of hurricanes. It was kind of quiet in that time. And I think I got interested in doing VAs back in 2004 when we had the 4 hurricanes. I lived up in Gainesville at the time. I just bought a house, and then I learned about needing to know about the floodplains, and then learning that you might not have everything disclosed when you buy your house in Florida. And so yeah, it's been a really big learning curve. I've now worked, let's see, in 5 states. I think I've done like 30 vulnerability assessments over the past 15 years. And we keep learning. And each time that we do these, we learn more. And I would just say that stormwater is the most important thing to focus on. And I'll stop there.
Good morning, Alan Biddlecombe from Pasco County. I've been with Pasco County 7 years, working in the public infrastructure branch as program administrator, currently transitioning into a role as chief program manager with the Office of Strategy and Sustainability. Prior to working for Pasco, I accumulated about 30 years of different kinds of experience in the environmental field and working with, mostly in the consulting sector, with environmental and engineering design firms. So working within Pasco County, I've worked with all of our departments in public infrastructure, now in the Office of Strategy and Sustainability, working with all of our different branches and departments across the county on issues of sustainability and resilience. So we do have a lot of team members here who are working on our Resilient Pasco project, but we'll get into some questions about that. So happy to be here.
All right. Thank you all for being here, helping us navigate some of the tougher questions that surround vulnerability assessments. Part of what the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council is doing for vulnerability assessments, aside from conducting them, is we offer technical assistance to our communities. That could be anything from just having an open forum meeting to getting into the nitty-gritty about the technical aspects of it. I'm going to discuss some of the feedback that we've received that kind of is guiding the questions that we have, and hopefully we can get answered today. One of the biggest concerns is becoming stuck in analysis paralysis. In other words, feeling like we're in a constant state of doing vulnerability assessments and when do we move on to the next step. This concern stems from updates to Florida legislature pertaining to the Florida Resilient Grant Program and vulnerability assessments. So Eddie, a big question is, can you tell us what those already working on vulnerability assessments must do now and in the future to be compliant? And what kind of preview can you give us for the Resilient Florida Grant Program opportunities this year?
Oh, boy. I feel like I'm in a firing line here.
You are.
Yeah.
If you didn't catch that, Alan said you are. Maybe save the harder ones for the hallway. No, so I'll talk briefly about some of the bigger changes in the statute. There's really two main changes when it comes to the requirements of the vulnerability assessment. There's going to be a shift in the projections that are used. Now, I say all this, there is a pending legislation that hasn't been signed. So technically, these are not the requirements yet, but they would be effective July 1st if that bill is signed by the governor. The first shift in the projections is going from the 2017 NOAA projections to the 2022 projections. Quick brief summary, if you compare the two, the 2022 projections are a little more conservative in the way that the curves aren't quite as steep. And if you line them up, kind of lay them on one over the other, as you're in the higher projections, like the high and the intermediate high, those are sort of in 2022 more aligning with the 17, like one level down. So the high is kind of more like the intermediate high. The intermediate high is kind of more like the intermediate. When you get into the lower, they kind of align pretty closely. There's not a big a difference, but so using those projections and then also shifting, we're developing a statewide vulnerability assessment that's going to incorporate local data as well as some state-run projections, working together with the Florida Flood Hub, with some of our other partners like Taylor Engineering and a modeling company called Fathom, to establish a statewide vulnerability assessment. Now that's going to be a lot higher resolution than the local governments can prepare. So there's going to be sort of a dual use and ability to show vulnerability in either to unlock sort of project funding. But that has to be updated every 5 years, and we want to incorporate local data. So eventually when the program started, it was, let's look at 20 and 50 years into the future. So that was 2040, 2070. Obviously, I don't need to tell a room of smart people how time works, but we're a lot closer to 2040 now than we were then. So there's going to be a shift to now start looking at 2050 and 2080. And every time we update ours, Local governments may choose to update their own, and so we would shift those projections. So I think all that to say, the way that the bill is written, and I don't interpret statute or law, I can do analysis on it. I leave that for OGC. But we feel pretty confident that local governments that are currently underway of conducting the vulnerability assessment don't need to do anything when that bill goes into effect. There's language in there that would allow the 2017 projections to remain. The projects that are vulnerable in those assessments would be eligible until that assessment is updated. And there's really no time frame set on when that needs to be done. So we're pretty confident that those projects that are currently underway are still going to be valid. They're still going to be compliant. You're still going to be able to show an asset is vulnerable and apply for funding. Now, if you're at a point where you want to kind of shift and you want to look at the 2022, we would encourage that. We can support that. There might have to be some amendments to the agreements. We might have to wait until July when it actually goes into effect. But if you're kind of already past that point, we don't feel that you would have to shift gears or pivot or anything if it's too late. So we're interpreting that to be as flexible as we can for local governments. And we'll have another grant opportunity open. So if you did go too far and you can't really shift, but you still do want to see the 2022 or run that analysis using 2022, you can apply for another planning grant, and we can either amend your current grant to extend it and include some more funding, or start a new grant agreement if you've already closed out. I think that was a two-part question. The other part was maybe a little preview of what the opportunities might be this summer, opening on July 1st, as we have in the past several years. Included in that bill is also some additional opportunities for funding, specifically in our planning grant offering, if you will, the category. So a couple of new categories. We would be allowed to do grants to update a local asset inventory, including what's regionally significant. So if you do want to take a look at the inventory, or maybe you have another source, or want to incorporate that into your current inventory, we can do funding for that. We can fund adaptation plans, efforts to prepare the community for flooding and sea level rise, anything that's developing policies, strategies, or adaptation plans. So we expect a lot of local governments are going to want to build on their vulnerability assessment by doing an adaptation plan. And so we can now clearly, or when that becomes effective, we can fund those. And then there's also a cost of permitting for nature-based solutions is also an eligible category. So that would be new this year from House Bill 1557, if you're interested in looking up what some of those changes are. And then we also have the implementation grant funding, which according to statute, the state has committed at least $100 million to every year. So unless there's an act of the legislature that were to change that, then we expect to have at least $100 million in opportunity for local government implementation projects. So these are anything that would adapt a critical asset to flooding or sea level rise. Critical assets are pretty broad category. It can be community facilities, transportation, evacuation routes, natural, cultural, historical buildings or parks, as well as critical infrastructure. So broad categories are available there to be defined as critical assets.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot.
That was a lot.
I wanted to get the hard stuff out of the way first, right? So it sounds like there's lots of opportunities coming up. Thank you for that information. There's another concern that there may be a lack of capacity within our local governments to conduct these vulnerability assessments. As you just heard Eddie speak to, there are tons of opportunities now and coming up. So the capacity within our staff to be able to do all this work has been a big concern. Where do we even start? Do we have the staff? Do we have the data? So Sam, I wanted to ask you, HAF has been working on several vulnerability assessments. From the standpoint of technical how-to, what are some of the things that local governments should have in place and have a good understanding of when working on a vulnerability assessment? And what are some of the data sets that you are using as part of the assessment process?
Thank you. It'll be tough to follow Eddie there, but so generally the vulnerability assessment process, it begins with data collection, right? Knowing what your assets that you have, or under your purview. And, it could be critical assets, structural assets, road assets, and all of that information. So having a good understanding of all the assets that are within the bounds of that study area or vulnerability assessment areas is a big requirement. The second part of that vulnerability assessment is to quantify that risk. So that's where that modeling or real data comes into play. So, the Florida statutes defines, vulnerability assessments to be done against, sunny day flooding or, increase in sea level rise, storm surge, future rainfall, and compound flooding. So those are four primary categories against which you evaluate the risk of those assets. So there is some deficiency on that availability of that data set to be able to do that assessment, right? Like you can only determine the risk to a structure if you have those flood depth rasters. So a lot of times in our experience, what we have found that we have to go rely back on, say, FEMA 100-year floodplain data sets, and some of that data is a little dated. As changes have occurred over the past 20-ish years, you want to be able to capture that change in flood risk. And it becomes even more challenging when you go into the future rainfall realm, right? So you have these global climate models that have 20 possible outcomes, and you're trying to project what your changes in future precipitation are, which is already uncertain. And then you take that and you try to determine what is your change in flooding depths and extents. So, in the absence of those models or up-to-date models that can quantify that flooding, that's always been a challenge, and let's say you have crossed that hurdle and have all those data sets. A big gap, I think, that we have on the asset side is reliable finished floor elevation data. So it's one thing to know where your structures are, but another thing to know, like, at what point will the water enter the house, right? So being able to have that kind of a data set, like elevation certificates is a good way to get a hold of that data, but I don't believe it's a statewide data set. And in some areas you'll find elevation certificates and some not. You have the national structure inventory, but then there too, it's an assumption that whatever the ground elevation we assume a plus 0.5 foot. I mean, is that real, or is that's an assumption, right? So maybe at the planning level, that's good enough. But when you move into the adaptation planning phase, it's probably a time to go look back, like, okay, these are my hotspots. Do I need to, do like a quick mobile LiDAR, right? Those are efficient, quick processes to be able to, ping your finished floor elevations, give you that extra level of confidence. So that's definitely, I think, a data gap that needs to be overcome to be able to, reasonably quantify that flood risk. On the assessment side, I mean, there is generally a lack of inland riverine models. I hope the Florida Flood Hub at some point, that will address that. But again, it's also a issue of scales, right? If you're looking at like a 10-county region, a base level engineering kind of modeling is probably okay. But if you're looking at vulnerability assessment for a smaller city or a focused area, there the challenges become do I need to consider my stormwater pipes? Do I need to consider that stormwater management aspect? So even with that flood hub, I think it will always be an issue of scale, and how do you take that granular data and kind of mishmash it with the larger product. I think, while the riverine side is definitely a gap, there is also a gap on the compound flooding space. There has been a lot of work on the sea level rise and also the storm surge space, like, the FEMA studies, they had an AdCirc model. So the results are from that AdCirc model. And more recently, the Army Corps completed the South Atlantic Coastal Study. So for the entire Florida coast, you have, a statewide storm surge data set. But when it comes to compound flooding, it involves a lot of really technical statistical assessment, location-based, to understand if there is a dependency between the rainfall and your storm surge. So if storm surge produces a flooding depth of 10 foot, it's that's the first thing that came to mind. So 10 foot and your rainfall produces 5 foot, it's not always, you take the maximum and maybe that's your ultimate flooding, even if there's a compound relationship. What the scientific community is telling us is that, if there is 100-year rainfall and if there is a 100-year surge, that depth is probably more than just the 10. So it involves complicated statistical assessment, region-based, to understand if there is that dependency, and therefore for a 100-year storm, what could be your that coastal boundary condition. So that is definitely, I think, a data gap that needs to be addressed, when looking at vulnerability assessment from a standpoint of compound flooding. I think the last step is basically that sensitivity assessment, right? Like, you have all of your assets, you intersect it with your different flood hazard data sets, and then come up with a sensitivity rating. I think, there's definitely room for improvement, innovation there. But, at a planning level, I think, the most important things are your asset data and that flood hazard data, and reducing the uncertainty in those two aspects that ultimately come together to give you that vulnerability assessment. So.
Very good. Thank you. Are there any data sets available that would be a good jumping off point to get your vulnerability assessment started?
Yes. So I guess once the Flood Hub is up, so that will be a good one. For Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council, have worked on a project where we came up with a platform that is able to readily ingest any flood hazard data that's available, and produce your flood quilt or map, basically, for the region that you select. So the tool is there for the 7-county region, I believe. And we had produced like a region-wide terrain, and readily, whatever data was available at the time, this is now 6 months in, I guess, those products were produced. So at that time, whatever flood hazard data were produced, we produced those rasters. And so if you are within the TBRPC region and you're starting a vulnerability assessment, please reach out to Amy, and she can get you in touch with that data set. So that's definitely one of the data sets that is regionally specific, and the statewide data set would be very, very helpful.
Thank you. In addition to that, we are also working with Jason and Stetson on developing a region-wide high tide flood data set that you will also be able, your communities can use in their vulnerability assessments as well. And with that, Jason, the Resilient Florida Grant Program is funding many flood vulnerability assessments at the local government level, with the intent of continuously improving and refining the statewide flood and sea level rise data sets. What are some of the ways data is being translated into the planning and project development process?
Yeah, so that's it's a really good question. So what I will just kind of amplify with Sam is that it's really incumbent for anyone that wants to get projects, is actually to get your asset inventory in line. So the communities that I've worked with that have had the most success in terms of going on to projects is they've got really good assets. They've got really good understanding of what the vulnerability is. And even more, if you have a story to tell about, say a particular project. And so, for example, like Satellite Beach, Florida, that's an area that I've worked at. And they actually had a fire station that was at high risk of flooding. And then we saw that through the VAs. We heard that through, they had like experiences with events. And I'm not sure that they actually went through DEP for the project funding, but through that process, kind of telling the story of what happened, they actually got a lot of money, and they're actually have actually moved it up to a spot that's much higher. And so I know that with DEP that like for you to actually get onto the project list, right? Then you have to go through the planning stages. You have to go through the VAs. And so it is a painful process, and kind of hearing Sam and hearing about the modeling and all of the wrangling over the models. And it's really important, and they are improving. But I just want to stress over and over again, it's really that asset inventory and getting that together and focusing in on that, because the models are going to change, especially with rainfall. And yeah, even with sea level rise, that's going to change. What's going to happen with storm surges, that can always change. But your assets, and of course you are going to improve your assets, but getting those in line, and having done, I don't know, 30 of these across the Southeast, that with each local government, it's kind of like a detective story is what I always say. When you go and you start working with a local government, and to see how the assets and what you see that some local governments have been very good at, you see some that they don't have good records and other things. And so just knowing that each VA is unique, and each community, right, you've got 50, 60 years of data. Things like stormwater in particular, that I always harp on stormwater, because that's almost always going to be the first thing that fails. And then we see that we have a lot of failing infrastructure with stormwater. And that's where I think with VAs and understanding the issues, say like with compound flooding and with issues where we actually see the high tide flooding, they don't want to know where their stormwater infrastructure is, right? And because they're afraid that if they know, then they're gonna have to do something about it, right? And so they know there's a problem, but then it's not mapped, and so yeah, I hear people laughing, but this is something I've heard maybe 5 or 6 times. I'm like, it's going, so you're going to know eventually the problem's going to be here. And so it's better to confront it. And the state has carrots. And then there's a lot of money with the federal government right now as well. And these opportunities in terms of funding for these type of projects, you know, this is kind of generational funding that's out there right now. And so the opportunity is now to understand where you have the vulnerabilities, be creative, and think while you're doing it, what you want your community to look like. And so I just absolutely love the video from before, like showing the surveys and like, what do people want? And so typically what people want is not just a giant, like ugly, like seawall and a pump, even though we need those in certain places. But when we go in and we do these adaptation projects, and then we're doing green infrastructure, and you're kind of beautifying areas, and it becomes a community amenity. And so that's what I encourage people to think about, is while you're doing adaptation, it doesn't have to be this doom and gloom and we're flooding. We can come up with ways that we're going to improve things, and we can improve flooding. If we have a Category 5 hurricane, what do we do about that? We probably evacuate, right, in Tampa Bay. But in terms of these other events that we can really improve, and so again, think in terms of opportunities, and yeah, I'll stop there. I think that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. You bring up a very good point too. We want the community's feedback. We need to know what they do want to see. We want to know if, you know, there's something we're missing, maybe a street floods and we have no idea because nobody's ever called it in. So some experiences across the region and statewide, there have been varied approaches to gathering this stakeholder engagement with widely varying results. Some have had success, while others have had little to no interest from their communities to engage on these projects. I have personally experienced that with 2 different communities that the public open houses, they just didn't show up for varied reasons. So I wanted to ask Alan, what has been Pasco County's approach to initiating your vulnerability assessment, and what are some successful methods being used to increase public engagement and obtain and leverage important community information and perspectives that we need?
Thanks, Amy. So Pasco's a little bit different. You've probably seen this presented before, that our funding for our vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning has come from the federal government. We received a CDBG MIT grant from HUD by way of Florida Commerce, and we got it before the current requirements. Took us a while to get it off the ground, but now we're at altitude practically. We're finishing up the vulnerability assessment now, and our funding will allow us to roll right into the adaptation planning. So our public engagement kind of comes in between. But before I go there, in terms of our approach, we had a little bit of handicap early on in designing our whole vulnerability assessment approach, in as much as there were restrictions that came down from HUD in terms of seeking lots of input from the consultant community. And that was unfortunate, I think, in my opinion, just based upon my previous experience in the engineering design community. But I think we've gotten a lot of great guidance. But also, over the time that we've been working on it, we've also been able to reach out and engage with not just externally, but internally. And another thing that makes our process a little bit different is that our grant requires us to make our vulnerability assessment and our adaptation plan countywide, including our municipalities. Now, we're not like Pinellas. We don't have that many municipalities. We have 4 of medium-sized municipalities, some of whom are in the room. So I'm happy that even attending today from Pasco County, we have Commissioner Jack Mariano, and from City of Port Richey, Mayor Hoover, and City Manager Matt Koppler. I think I saw you on the run. I don't know if you're in the room, but I saw you on the registration. And from City of Newport Richey, Pete Altman, Councilman Pete Altman. So we've been attempting to engage with our leadership, and everybody has been very supportive in terms of engaging publicly. Our elected officials are really the experts at that. So seeking their input, their guidance has been very critical. While I'm at it, I just want to give a shout out to our team. Amanda Hill and Michaela McMahon and Laura Wakefield are here. They've been so instrumental on working on the Resilient Pasco project. Raise your hands, guys. Right there in the middle. Nolan Ristow, I think I saw you on the registration, and there's a number of other people from Pasco County. So our approach has been kind of long in developing, but first, vulnerability assessment, aligning all of our asset inventory, infrastructure and asset inventory, and then with HAF as our consultant and Taylor Engineering and Fernleaf as their subs, we've worked through the vulnerability assessment. Now we're at the point where we're reviewing it, looking at those results. It's a lot to look at and trying to figure out what does it mean, what's next. Like I said, our funding allows us to roll right into adaptation planning. That's something that'll happen later on this summer. But now is the time for our public engagement. We decided, to answer your question in part, Amy, to wait until we have vulnerability assessment results before we do any public engagement meetings. In approaching that, we've engaged with our media relations team within the county to kind of design a whole approach for that, a media rollout and public engagement plan. And there's a lot of components to that. our media relations team is expert at doing that, and also working with the county leadership, including elected officials. So it's a multi-step process, and I'd be happy to talk through it with anybody, or probably more appropriately, refer you to our team. So we'll have some public meetings coming up, and we're hoping to get a good turnout. I know Hillsborough County recently did a public engagement meeting related to vulnerability assessment. So whenever I hear about meetings in other counties, I'm always eager to find out how many people did you get turnout. And, you know, it does range from 0 to 10 or more. So we're hoping for more. Another thing we did is we undertook a survey of sorts, a community survey. And Michaela, do you have the current number approximately? 500, 600? Okay, so we've had about 600 and some respondents to our survey, so we're working on that. That will not close until August, so that stays open, our community survey. So, so there's a number of different components to it. Did I leave anything out, Amy?
No, I don't think so. I do have a follow-up question, though. That's really, really a good amount of feedback from your survey. Through what avenues have you pushed that survey? Have you dropped it off at community civic associations, or have you put it online? How have you?
It's online. It's been on billboards. We've printed some handouts, announced it in different types of meetings. It's been pushed pretty good, but we haven't really engaged with a public outreach professional to do it. It's just been through internal staff.
Okay, thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about the adaptation planning process. We complete our vulnerability assessments, and the next step would be that adaptation plan. The purpose of that plan is to take those critical assets and the focus areas that were identified in the VAs and build that mitigation priority project list, or your mitigation actions. Alan, you had mentioned that you are doing your VA and following it directly with your adaptation plan. What are the pros and cons of doing it right away or putting it off until, say, next fiscal year with more grants and funding and availability?
I think potentially some of the advantages include that the results of the vulnerability assessment is fresh in everybody's mind. But then on the other hand, the disadvantage is if we've just completed our vulnerability assessment, figuring out what those results are and what does it mean. Now, within county government like ours, or a medium to large size county government where there's 3,000 or so employees on the staff, we have a lot of different departments. Some of our departments will get it. They'll be able to digest and figure out how to utilize vulnerability assessment results because they are used to doing planning. And I'm thinking, because this is kind of where I come from, I'm thinking of an example of utilities. So with Pasco County Utilities, they already have GIS analysts, GIS professionals on their team, within the utilities team. And they're used to looking at their systems, their assets, their infrastructure from the standpoint of master planning every so often, and looking at different threats and vulnerabilities. If anybody's familiar with the America's Infrastructure Act, the IWIA something, I can't remember the complete acronym, but they went through that process a couple of years ago, looking at vulnerabilities, and that included cyber vulnerabilities as well. So that was, but that was kind of like a first dipping their toe in the water. Utilities will be able to, they'll be able to digest and incorporate these results and then speak about next steps in terms of adaptation pretty quickly, pretty easily. Other departments may not be so well versed or so ready to, like I said, digest the results. And I'm thinking about the public services oriented departments of community development and human services and those types of departments. Our Parks Department is represented here. I saw on the registrations, I haven't seen you in person yet, sorry. But I see they're here, and they have a lot of assets that are exposed, coastal assets. One of the things that I left out in talking about our grant is that it also included a living shorelines plan for the county. And that was specifically for our Parks, Recreation, and Natural Resources Department. They have, some of their assets are the coastal parks. So we've worked through, with the help of HAF, a plan on what to do with living shorelines. Now, it's not a complete, all-inclusive, countywide, our entire coastline type of plan, but we picked parks to work as representative planning locations. And then they also developed a homeowner's guide to living shorelines. So I forgot the original question. Did that answer your question?
You answered it.
Okay, good,
Thank
good.
you.
To that, Alan, I mean, if I could follow up, I mean, do you see a need to come up with a standardized approach to actually come up with those hotspots? I mean, there's so much going on, right? You know, in terms of results and assessment, and we have, right now, I think it's a whittled down Excel spreadsheet that kind of shows the risks. But is there a need for like a standardized approach to be able to say, okay, it's more than just, you know, those structures, right? Are there certain hotspots within your study area that needs to be addressed through projects? So do you see a gap
I think
there?
the interesting thing about county government, at least one of our size, is that standardized approaches of how to do something it may not always be the right approach. I don't know this for sure, but I think I would see us doing more of a hybridized approach because each department, whether it's utilities or public works or our facilities department, all of those are asset owners, right? There's some of our departments that really don't own assets, but utilities owns a lot of assets, wastewater plants, water plants, pipes in the ground. Our facilities department is responsible for all of our buildings in the county. So they own a lot of assets. Public Works as well, responsible for all the roads. They all have individual needs. They all have individual programs and funding. Some of them are funded out of the general fund. Some of them are enterprise funds. So they're, one size does not fit all for our departments. And I would see it as more of a hybridized approach. Mm-hmm. And that's where we hope within the Office of Strategy and Sustainability under Mark Bellis's guidance, he's our new Resilience and Sustainability Director, Officer. And we're working on how to guide our departments, how to work with and guide our departments. Funding is an issue, of course, so we have a high amount of appreciation for Eddie and his team, and so we're working on all of that. But to answer your question, I think hybridized approach.
I just wanted to make sure that, you know, if there's a way that HAF could make it better.
Of course.
Always be closing.
Yes.
And I'll say, from our perspective at the Office of Resilience Coast Protection, you know, we don't want a standard approach either because the needs of different communities are going to be different. So St. Augustine may want to prioritize their natural or historical resources. Another county might prefer their police and fire, or Northwest Florida might want their living shorelines, you know, so we specifically don't prioritize any kind of project over another in our scoring criteria, and that's why we want to provide the funding for the adaptation planning so that those priorities can be determined by the local government, by the commission or the board, so that we're helping the local government help in the areas that they want help in.
Good, thank you. Any additional information from any of you or anything you'd like us to know before we turn it over to audience questions? Any unexpected challenges from results of VAs or?
The one thing I'll say is you kind of have to meet people where they are, and that includes externally and internally. Like I mentioned, a lot of our departments are different. They have different needs. They have different challenges. A lot of them have a lot on their plate. So we've worked hard to try to, reach out to them and offer, our help within the Office of Strategy and Sustainability. And you got to figure out how to talk to people and engage, and including, the other large stakeholders within your area, whether it's municipalities or others.
I wrote a couple things down just to mention quickly. So if you heard Dr. Brooks's message earlier, there is an executive order for us to get vulnerability assessments for the Chief Resilience Officer in partnership with DEP to get vulnerability assessments for every community in Florida. Once we get close to that mark, which we're really close, I mean, I think we're under 50 communities at this point that we're targeting for outreach for this year. Some of the modeling that you mentioned could potentially become, elevated in the priorities if it's going to help inform the statewide assessment. Right now, our priority is the vulnerability assessments, but then we're going to move to adaptation plans and then potentially some of those modeling efforts, given that the appropriation, continues. I'm also kind of surprised that more vulnerability assessments didn't include elevation certificates. So I actually came from the state coordinating NFIP office in emergency management, and elevation certificates were everything to the floodplain management office. And when I came over to DEP, I expected everyone to say, we don't even know the elevations of our critical facilities. We need funding to hire a surveyor to go shoot those. So that could also be an eligible activity, hot tip. If you identify it as a data gap in your analysis, then we want to help you fill that data gap, right? I mean, how can you effectively evaluate the vulnerability of a structure not knowing where the floor is? Now, I know there's a lot of like Google and machine learning and stuff out there that you can kind of get a good estimate, but real ECs might be good. And then I wanted to mention also, so I'm only here representing Resilient Florida program, but DEP has a ton of other programs. We mentioned green stormwater infrastructure. Our division of water restoration assistance is currently open for grant opportunities specifically for green stormwater infrastructure. They also have water quality grants that can include septic to sewer conversions, things that would improve water quality in Biscayne Bay, Indian River Lagoon. So if you go to protectingfloridatogether.gov, that is sort of the centralized DEP portal for what application opportunities are open. So it's all one word, Protecting Florida Together. And then you can apply for those grants as well. So those are going to close, and then Resilient Florida is going to open. So the agency is really trying to make a coordinated effort to make sure that we're guiding projects towards the right programs, and those are open currently.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, I want to go ahead and turn it over to any audience questions. Okay.
Thank you all. That was very fascinating. I'm Janet Bowman with the Nature Conservancy. My question is, looking ahead to sort of adaptation plans. I mean, the vulnerability assessment data that you all are coming up with is so informative and critical for all sorts of planning activities beyond just identifying projects for the Resilient Florida program. And so I'm curious, I mean, maybe Dr. Evans, you can answer this in terms of other areas you've seen where this information can be translated to or used in land use decision-making, updating comprehensive plans, for example, or regional policy plans, or, the link to land use, to me, is, I'm not hearing that from what you all are saying. And that may be sort of the next generation, but I'm curious about how you all see this information being used in that context.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that a little bit. So we are working on some projects right now. I'm working on some projects right now. It's actually through the Resilient Florida program. And then we've linked it up actually to green space. And so thinking of green space and acquisitions in the Florida Wildlife Corridor, and then making the resilience linkage, right? So green space, if we think about our natural lands in Florida, that we like them for all the purposes of wildlife and fishing and all the things, of course, that we love about Florida, but they're also providing the service. They're also providing a lot of flood control services for us. And so thinking about the way that land use and how we grow and thinking about what it looks like in the future, that's kind of, that is the next phase, or that's one of the next phases of, I think, where this needs to go. And so I use the example actually would be Ian, right? Hurricane Ian. And so I worked with Orange County. We actually did a Resilient Florida grant there, and we actually were looking at things like green space, and we wrote a chapter, and this would have been in May of 2022, where we described just in like a narrative framework that if we had a storm that dumped 10 inches of rain, and then that had happened within Orange County 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that there'd be flooding in places that no one would expect. It would be outside of the 100-year floodplain, that we know the stormwater systems would fail in certain areas. And it was kind of ignored at first, but then when Ian came through within the next week, my phone was just ringing off the hook because that's exactly what happened. And so understanding land use and the understanding especially it's areas that were built between the 50s and the 90s. That area there, that there's a lot of issues in terms of flooding risk that I think is not well understood yet. So we've had a lot of land use changes, and then without thinking of these big events, right? So when we were building in those areas, we weren't thinking of Hurricane Ians, and we weren't thinking about these supersized storms and having the Atlantic like it is right now. And so thinking how land use and thinking about how conservation and thinking about comp plans and where we grow and how we grow is really, 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 really important. And I think there are some opportunities, again, with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which passed unanimously. It wasn't made for the purpose of thinking of flood control, but it can help. And so I think being creative in these opportunities and within this moment where there is a lot of funding for these issues, and again, there's this consensus that we're not going to have a wall, right? We're going to have the 900 people a day are moving to Florida, and there's nothing that we can do to stop that, really. But we can think about how we grow and think about, areas that are providing these services. We probably want to keep them in some kind of green space condition. And I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Hi, sorry. Jennifer Hoffman with Keep Manatee Beautiful, another nonprofit that's really worried about that section. You guys talked a lot about the carrot, all the money that's available. What about the opportunity for a bigger stick for all of the communities and businesses that do not want, they go kicking and screaming, let's put it that way and leave it there. But, what are the chances of more rules and regulations with the idea of where the environment is going versus where it was in the past and what has made the rules of today?
I'll let you tackle that.
Ooh, I'm gonna start sweating a little bit, so sorry if there's some shine coming from these spotlights. All I can say is, I came from a regulatory agency and now I'm working in a non-regulatory side of an agency, and the conversations with local governments go a lot better. When you're giving them free money, it's a little different than like, hey, you're not enforcing your regulations. I don't speak for the state or the legislature or the agency, but I think that that's something that would have to come through a grassroots effort through your local representatives and senators and things like that, because, you know, I'm a big fan of local voices, local choices, Florida Home Rule. This is, you know, we want to help local governments in the best way that the state can coordinate possible to meet their needs. And I'll sort of just leave that there.
From a, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got just one thought, and it's the National Flood Insurance Program, and that's going to be a stick, and also say the insurance is going to be the sticks, and it might not be the government sticks. It's going to be the private market and the National Flood Insurance Program. So that is actually the government, but there's a lot of pressure on the National Flood Insurance Program, and all it's going to take is, you know, we hope it doesn't happen, but the big storm that hits Florida that causes massive flooding, and then we saw that, of course, with Ian. But if we have another of those, and then I'll say, God forbid, if we had 2 of those in a year, that's going to be a stick. That's going to be a big stick. It's going to come from the feds. And I'll stop there.
From the county standpoint, I see a tie-in between the 2 questions, the question Janet asked and the current question. There's a lot going on within county government, at least within Pasco. We're working on a whole lot of different things, not just our Resilient Pasco project, but our comprehensive plan. We're updating our comprehensive plan. That will inform land development code. Different departments are working on major projects looking at assets and infrastructure. For example, Public Works is doing $1 million project on their stormwater master plan. That's been a long time coming, but it's a big project to look at all the different aspects of stormwater and drainage and management thereof within Pasco County. Utilities is doing master planning for water, wastewater, and reclaimed water, all concurrently. So there's a lot of different things happening all at once. And that's part of what I was talking about in terms of what departments and branches of government face and trying to meet them where they are. And when we go in and we try to talk to them about resilience, the buzzword these days, you know, they're burdened with a lot. So in terms of regulation, I don't think anybody really wants to hear about additional regulation, but trying to, you know, appropriately design a comprehensive plan and the things that informs is a real challenge. And there's a lot of great people within county government, not just in Pasco, but those, you know, we work a lot and talk a lot with our neighbors. And there's a lot of efforts going on trying to address a lot of the same things in all of our counties and the region. So thank you to the Regional Planning Council as well for providing guidance along those lines.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the app that you have submitted, and I do want to clarify one thing. We talked about, I think Eddie alluded to, that there is no strict requirement for updating the VAs at this point, right? There's no like, you have to do it every 5 years or anything like that for the local level.
Correct.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that because it was asked a few times within here. So I think at this time, you know, if you feel like you need to update it, or you have a bunch of new data and it's time to update it, or even if you align it with something like your update schedule for your local mitigation strategy, that might be a good way to kind of gauge whether it needs to be updated or as new guidance comes out. Thank you.
Yeah, and we expect, we're tracking that bill. that is awaiting the governor's signature, and once that bill is signed and there are changes, then we'll put out some formal guidance on, for local governments on that.
Okay, thank you. There was a question in here that I really like, and it seems like a simple question, but I don't think the answer is so simple. Why should jurisdictions complete the VAs before they start implementation?
I thought I asked to keep the hard ones in the hall.
Well, I think it's important to understand.
Well, okay, so the Senate Bill 1954 was the bill that created the program, unanimously passed through both chambers. So that was a really impressive effort by the legislature and was commended by the then Speaker Sprouse as the largest investment that a state has made in itself in this kind of arena that he's ever seen or known of. Sort of set up the framework to operate that way, to where you would assess the vulnerabilities, you would plan to adapt the focus areas or action areas that you want to identify, to then unlock the funding for implementation projects. So I think it was just set up that way. A lot of other states that are working on resilience programs are really far behind when it comes to actually providing funding. They have stood up tremendous planning efforts to have a framework and have long-range plans and short-range plans, and I don't want to discredit that at all. But Florida kind of did it a little bit the other way around, to where we wanted to get the funding out to the local governments so that they can start planning and decide what's best for them and implementing those projects. So I think, and then personally, if you don't have an assessment of what's most vulnerable, then how do you know you're making the right investments? And there's a combination there of exposure and sensitivity, and a foot of water in a shed is different than a foot of water in a hospital. So we don't want to go adapting the wrong buildings and not getting the bang for the buck.
Thank you. I knew you could answer that. So I think I have time for one more question here. How can regional resilience entities best help local governments with completing vulnerability assessments? And that one was directed at you.
Me again?
I can help, but I'll let you start.
Well, we do provide funding for what we call regional resilience entities. It's a lot smaller pot offering, but so far it's been enough to support the efforts of multiple, typically taking the form of regional planning councils, but we've seen other coalitions and groups that are eligible for that. They're basically just coalitions of local governments that have formed these organizations for their regional planning and needs of the future. So we can provide grants to those organizations to really coordinate these multi-jurisdictional things. So we're getting a lot of feedback that different engineers like to use different methodologies, different expectations about what is exposure, how sensitive is one thing. One community might say, well, 18 inches of water is getting up above the electrical outlet, so that's really sensitive. Our low, medium, high is different than this other community's low, medium, high. So I think these regional groups can really provide the forum for those discussions and agreements or discussions and resolution of what might be best in that region. Just because the local governments sometimes seem like they don't have the resources, they don't have the capacity. Some of these grantees that we have, the county manager is the town manager, is the inspector, is the public works director, so they need help too. And so that's where the regional groups can kind of step in to facilitate. I don't know if you want to answer anything there, Alan, or just with your local perspective or not.
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really good.
So I can add a little bit to that. As a regional resiliency entity, some of the funding that we have received as a resilience entity is being used to provide that vulnerability assessment technical assistance to our member governments. So if any of you are working on your VAs and you have questions, or you just want to have a conversation, or you're stuck and need a certain data set and we might have it, reach out to me. Also, we're working on that regionally significant criteria asset list. So that is part of building that data set as well for the state. And we're also doing the high tide flood data set with Stetson. So that data will be available too, and I believe that that all comes to fruition in June. So those data sets will be available. So I just wanted to kind of conclude with that and thank everybody for being here, and thank you all so much for answering those really tough questions. And
I think I'm
thank
gonna
you.
get out of here. I gotta go home.
And he's gonna run.
I don't blame you.
So thank you.